this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to set up, solder, and finish your project. First, we're going to use layout blocks. This is a new system. We used to use boards. Now we're using tacks and aluminum blocks. We use a set square, and we set our pattern underneath. Sometimes, you don't have to. Set up a right angle with these two blocks. It doesn't really matter. We can stagger the blocks so that they don't overlap one another. Tack them in. Only 2 to 3 tacks per block are necessary. Then set up the other side, also using the set square, to make sure that every angle is 90 degrees. Ideally, your project should be exactly the same size as your original pattern, but things may shift a little bit. Check to see how things fit after you've got everything foiled, and this is when you can really see how well you did as far as your craftsmanship goes. If you've got any pieces backward, this is when you're going to know, so you may want to turn some pieces over because you may have numbered them on the wrong side. Then you nudge everything so that they hit the board. But what if you're missing pieces? This is how you replace them. When you're missing a piece, you set it up just like normal. This, I've got all of the layout blocks offset, which simply means none of the ends of those layout blocks are running into each other or overlapping. To replace that missing piece, which is the cloud one right there, I'm going to tear off a piece of scrap paper. Then I'm going to tuck that scrap paper right underneath where that open spot is. If you need to move some pieces out of the way temporarily, do that. And then put the pieces over that scrap paper. Put everything else back in place, and now you just trace it with a pencil. Trace all around, and then you can take that piece out. You're going to cut the inside of that line with regular scissors because there are no pieces around it, so you don't need to use pattern scissors. And now you have your custom pattern piece. So now just glue it onto glass, cut it, grind it like normal. But before you put it back in with foil on it, make sure to check to see that it's got enough room for foil. On custom pieces, they tend to be a little larger, so check to see that there's some wiggle room. Then foil it, and then put it back in. Never ever try to solder until you have all your pieces in place. And now you're ready. So why can't I just cut the missing pieces out of the second pattern? Well, that's a good question.
The answer is, when you first cut out your pattern, you used a pair of pattern shears, right? The pattern shears had a specific width of that blade, 1/16 of an inch, 32nd of an inch. So when you cut out your pattern, each piece was separated by the width of that blade. And if you were to cut out that piece separate from all the rest of the pieces, there's no telling if it would fit well or how it will fit.
When we replace the pieces at the very end, just before we solder, we set everything up and then we custom make that piece according to how your pieces fit now. To start soldering, we set up the project on a board using the set square, the push pins, and the layout blocks. Then you go to a solder station, position the fume extractor 6 inches from your work, and then look down or up and switch the fume extractor to the on. Plug in a soldering iron and then flip the power switch to on or reset. Make sure that you have put an apron in your lap and that you've covered up all exposed skin as much as possible. And now you're ready to solder. The first step to soldering is to apply flux. It comes in this little jar, which you only have just a little bit in there. Take the flux brush and you're going to spread it on your project. It gets on the glass and that's totally fine, but you're just going to spread it all over where the foil is, including the perimeter of your project. Your iron is hot, wipe off the tip of it with the sponge because there's all kinds of gross stuff on it when it just sits there. Unspool about 1 foot of solder and you're going to use the side of the iron to cut through an end of it. Don't hold the whole spool while you're soldering, you might drop it. Hold the iron so that you can use the underside of the tip to spread the solder. And then you're going to tack. Tacking is where we're just going to be putting dabs of solder where all of the pieces meet. Do the perimeter first. I set the end of the solder right where pieces meet, and then I use the tip of the iron to just push it down, and that places a little blob of solder right where all the joints meet. Tacking is only done on the first side. It's just to hold all the pieces together. So you don't solder anything until all of the pieces have been tacked. 2 tips for you when you're soldering. If the solder bit gets stuck, don't pull it. Just use the iron to melt it off. And if a solder bit drops on your project, wait for it to cool and pick it off with your fingernail. After tacking, remove all of the boards, all of the solder blocks, and then you'll have some room around all of your project. Give yourself some space around where you're working so that you don't feel like you're soldering into walls all around your project. Now we can start soldering. I'm going to drag the iron across the foil as I'm feeding the solder right on the tip. So that's going to deposit a bead of solder. A bead is a raised and rounded solder seam. It's not too much and it's not too little solder. It's not a blob of solder, but it's just enough for the foil to hold. You don't want too much solder. You don't want the solder being any place other than the foil. Shouldn't be on the glass. It should only be on the foil. And it should look nice and smooth. That's what we're trying to go for, is smooth, slightly raised and rounded solder seams. If you don't have a bead, then what you have is a flat seam. This is just where there's not enough solder. You would just put a little more flux on there and then add another layer of solder to make it rounded. The edge foil is still copper, so what we are going to do is we're going to coat the outside foil, that outer edge foil, with a thin layer of solder. And all you have to do is flux that foil and then drag your iron all along that foil. The iron already has some solder on the tip, so as long as there's flux on the foil, then the solder will stick to the foil. And then all of that copper is going to be silver. It's going to be the color of solder, and that is called tinning. And we always do that to the outside edges of the foil so that the copper is all covered. It's easier to hold your project vertically and then to drag your iron downwards so that any blobs that are sticking to the edge will just fall right off onto the solder board. But it's a very hot panel just because all the solder is holding in the heat. So you hold it by the larger pieces of glass. They are the coolest parts of your project. So if you have bigger pieces, like around these background pieces on this project, hold on to your project there. It will likely be cooler than the rest of the project. That way you can safely angle your project and get all of that edge foil tinned. We still have to solder the back side of this project, but before we do that, we need to go to the sink and wash off all this flux and grossness. Take it to the sink and use warm water and soap, and you're going to get all of this flux off. Rinse it really well. Don't worry about the numbers. The numbers are going to come off with either alcohol or acetone or WD-40. But you're trying to get all of the flux off so that the back side will be nice and clean. Blot it dry with a paper towel or a regular towel, and then you're ready for the back side. The thing you have to know about the back side is that when you do the front side, some of that solder will hit the board and it will stop. But there are other parts where there's a little bit of space in between. But when you go to do the second side, there's going to be air that's going to be trapped in there, and it's going to want to escape. That's where some danger comes in. You're going to need to have an apron in your lap and keep your skin as covered as possible when you do this backside. So now to solder this backside, we just add flux to the back, the whole thing, even all around the edges, and then we start soldering. You're going to start to see some air bubbles happening, and they pop. This is what we're talking about when we need to cover our skin and cover our laps with aprons, because you'll start to see that air bubbles will pop up, and sometimes they spit solder at you. And you'll see one coming up right about here. You see that? That pops up. Sometimes it's a little more violent than others, but can't be too careful. So you keep soldering, try and go fast on this second side. You'll get better at it, so your speed will improve over time. Try and get a bead the first or second time you go across the solder seams. You can always go back over seams later. But the trick is not to linger in any spot for too long, because then we don't want the heat to travel enough so that it melts to the other side. You'll see that the solder likes to stick to the outside edges, so you want to pick up your project and drag your iron all along to melt those blobs off. If you did not tin the edge to begin with, this is when you can do it. Tinning can happen at any time. It doesn't have to happen until the very end, or it can be after each side. It's whichever you prefer. Now it's time to check your solder seams. You're going to see blobs that have gone through to the other side, but you're also going to see spikes. This solder and this flux combination likes to leave sharp spots that will hurt you. Here's how you fix them. Here I'm just going back over some seams. You might want to let it cool for a minute or two before you do this, just so that it reduces the amount of heat that's on your project. To go over the seams, you just put more flux on there, and then you can smooth out anything that you think is a little too rough. Or you can add a little bit more solder if you need to. But you can even see the air bubbles popping up on this second side. Once you're satisfied with what your solder looks like on both the front and the back sides, then you can stop, wash off your project, and you're ready for the finishing. A little PSA about blobs of solder being melted. Please keep those off the jig because they burn right through, and they make the surface no longer level, and they make the room smell terrible. Once all the flux has been washed off, now it's time to get all the numbers off. For that we use alcohol, mineral spirits or acetone. That's for tougher things like paint markers, but just use a little on a paper towel and you just remove all of the Sharpie. Get every little bit off because sometimes it can be a little stubborn. Lastly comes the polish. We are going to be applying a little bit of this to a towel. First we have to shake it up. So you can set your project, if it's larger, on a towel on the counter. We just apply a little bit of wax to the towel. Again, after shaking it up, then it's wax on, and you're applying the wax to not just the glass but also to the solder seams, because we're trying to get all of the extra dirt and all of the flux residue all off of your project. So at first when you wax your project, it's going to be hazy. If you're using clear glass or anything that is cathedral, you're going to be able to see. It's very, very hazy when you bounce some light off of it. We've done the wax on, now it's time to wax off. So we use a dry part of the towel and we are going to be buffing all of that wax so that our solder and our glass is completely shiny and haze free. If we have cathedral glass or if we have glass that's see-through, we can hold it up to the light and we can look and see where there's still residue of wax. You'll want to go all the way up to the solder seams and really dig your fingertips along the solder, because that's where the wax likes to collect. And when it dries white. So you want to be sure to remove as much of that as possible. Take your time on this step because this is how people will see your project. So bounce some light off of it so that you can make sure that all of the haze has been removed, and make sure you do both sides just as nicely. Handle your project on the outside edges only to avoid putting fingerprints on it.